bit, yeah. Someone's going to do a PowerPoint from that computer.
Sure, do you want me to turn this on now? Because I don't.
Go ahead and turn it on now so it's ready. I don't think it will. Yeah, go ahead and put it on now. And then I'll actually just log it onto the CCEJ website.
No, I couldn't download it.
Let me know if this thing's hitting you, I'll move it off. See a button in your eye. I think it's just going right by you. Yeah, but you know, you feel it. I think you're clear. Okay.
Thank you.
There we go. Keith, just let us know when we're ready. Are we ready to go? Okay, well, we'll go ahead. So, apreciados amigos y amigas, qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la iglesia de todos los santos. Dear friends, it is a joy for us to be here together at All Saints Church this Sunday. Welcome to the forum. I know that the preacher went a little long this morning, so the service is a little late getting done. So thank you for coming on in. We have others joining us online, both on our live stream and Facebook and YouTube, and it's wonderful to have you here. Today we're going to be really diving in deep to actually some of the stuff we were talking about earlier this morning, about how do we become a community that is intentional about our dismantling of white supremacy culture and actively anti-racist. This is nothing new for All Saints Church, and it is specifically the work of our generation of this church to do this. And so your vestry and your staff are taking this on, and we're going to do it in a way that everyone gets to come along, because that's the whole point. It's about us changing and being transformed ourselves for the transformation and healing of the community and the world. So we're going to kind of put some stuff in context for you. We will have joining us very soon Daniel Celise from the California Conference on Equality and Justice, who are kind of our Sherpas through a lot of this work and doing really amazing things helping us with this. And you'll hear from Daniel. And then we're going to hear about the history, what's going on right now, and then, of course, the most important piece is what can we all do and how can we be a part of this together? And, of course, time for your questions. So I want to start off by turning it over to our senior warden, Monique Thomas. Yeah, absolutely worthy of applause. And Monique, can you give us some history about the racial justice resolution and sort of where a brief recent history of All Saints Church dealing with race and dismantling white supremacy?
Absolutely, thank you. So, as most of us know, All Saints has always been a leader in terms of racial justice and social justice work. And in the fall of 2015, I was one of the co-chairs of the Racial Justice Ministry along with Edna Trigg. And so we were talking about racial justice and sort of the future of this work. And Johari DeWitt Rogers at the time, who was also a member of the Racial Justice Ministry, said, do we have a racial justice resolution? We've got these incredible resolutions around all of these social justice issues. We have to have one. And at the time, Zelda Kennedy was still here, and she said, of course we have a resolution. I'll look for it, I'll find it. Well, it turns out we didn't have one. And so Johari said, I really do feel like that we need, although we do this work, we need something that really sort of grounds us in this work in terms of a resolution. So myself, Johari, and Edna became the primary writers of this resolution, along with so many incredible members of All Saints who contributed to that work. By April of 2016, the Racial Justice Resolution was passed by the vestry, and we decided that we were going to live into that work. And there are 9 points to the resolution. As a result of that, point number 9 or 10.9 is the formation of a racial justice advisory board. And essentially what this group does is it advises the vestry on issues around race and racial justice in our community, in the world, and essentially letting this community, guiding the community in the work and saying, these are the issues that are important, these are the issues that we as all saints should be paying attention to, and how we go deeper into the work.
Okay, there we go. And so that all happened before I got here. And it actually happened like really, really a short period of time before I got here. And so when I became your rector and we began this journey together, one of the first things that I saw, actually while I was still living in St. Louis, was this racial justice resolution. And frankly, I was incredibly impressed, and I thought this is really, really powerful stuff. I had not seen an Episcopal church do something like this and make this commitment. The other thing we know, though, is that resolutions are just pieces of paper unless you do something about them. And so early on, as we began to work together as a vestry, we looked at that item about creating a racial justice advisory board. And it looked to me, it was something we'd already promised to do, and when you promise to do something, it's probably a pretty good idea to do it. But secondly, that was potentially the key to the resolution, because you needed to have some group that had ownership of this, that would prevent this from just being one more thing that we thought was nice that gets put on a shelf. So we formed a racial justice advisory board, and one of the members of that board, the co-chair of that board, Barbara Andrade-Dubransky, is here. And Barbara, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Racial Justice Advisory Board and the work that you've done, but then also kind of introduce the partnership with CCEJ and kind of where we got to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Racial Justice Advisory Board had the resolution to give us some direction as a church. However, what we recognized was that we needed to provide some practical recommendations to put this resolution into practice. So in 2018, the Racial Justice Advisory Board presented its first set of recommendations to the vestry, and the vestry approved those recommendations at that time. So that was about 3.5 years ago. And to put this in context, the larger Episcopalian Church had adopted the beloved community. So the beloved community is the framework for the Episcopalian Church to address racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. And it gave us some really important elements to work with. So a key element to that would include, for example, moving forward with something like a census and an audit. And what a census and audit would do would provide a head count and a heart count as a way that it's framed, so that we know who we're made up of here, and so that we also know what the understanding of racial justice looks like. So how do people perceive being anti-racist as opposed to, I think, what we're more used to is being not racist? And how do we take what we think of as our interpersonal, our personal beliefs about race to a structural level? So that really supported the recommendations, and the recommendations, there were a number of them, some around child safety, some around how we convened ourselves to do this work, some around how we grow in our diversity from the pew to the pulpit. And in there were also various aspects of training, starting with leadership, starting with the vestry and the clergy and the staff and other leaders in the church, and then with the intent to move on to the broader community. So that was about 3.5 years ago, and today, working with CCEJ, we have that opportunity to begin to explore, having, as we put in the recommendations, courageous conversations, and learning about what it means to be anti-racist, as I mentioned, as a different framework than our sense of ourselves as people who are not racist. What does it mean to make structural changes, to recognize the sometimes sacrifices that need to be made in order to achieve a greater level of justice, and prepare ourselves to do even more powerful work in the community. We know that this church has had a strong presence in the community around its messaging around these issues, but how can we be more impactful around changing the type of white supremacist policies and actions that occur at a policy and at a community level? So it's important, before we continue down that road, that we understand who we are as people, and this opportunity with CCEJ is an initial step and those recommendations from 3.5 years ago to start that work with leadership here in the congregation.
Do you want to talk a little about, just briefly, about the working group on the vestry and sort of how this is structurally working?
So the Racial Justice Advisory Board is made up of a group of about a dozen people. A couple of those people, in addition to several vestry members, have created a working group. And what this does is it allows the recommendations from the Racial Justice Advisory Board to be considered and supported in terms of how they are brought to the vestry. Because as I mentioned, it's been 3.5 years, and the vestry has really just been looking for its way in terms of how to take these recommendations and turn them into action. So this working group allows representatives from the vestry and from the RJAB to come together to work out how to raise these issues to the vestry and how to make it more possible for the vestry to take action on these recommendations.
That's great, thank you, and appreciate that. And now we're grateful to be joined by Daniel Celise from CCEJ. Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm going to give you just a second to catch your breath. I know you've been caught in traffic for a while, and really appreciate you being here. So what we were looking for is, one of the things about this work, like so much work that any of us have in transformation in any area, is the challenge is we don't know what we don't know. And in fact, that's a phrase that we've tended to use a lot. And what that means is we need help. We need help seeing, well, what are the aspects of our life and community that seem absolutely, fine to us, that are loaded with some stuff that we don't even see, many of us, particularly people like me, because we're just so used to living in it. And we were looking out for resources for this. Now, fortunately, we live in one of the largest cities on this planet that is chock full of good resources. But frankly, the way that we found CCEJ involves a contact that I had back from my St. Louis days. When I was at Christ Church Cathedral in St. Louis, and together we were going through the Ferguson Uprising, there was an amazing leader there named Rena Hajat Carroll, and Rena ran something called the Diversity Awareness Partnership in St. Louis, and did incredible work of just this kind, working with congregations and nonprofits, and actually for-profit companies doing this work. Well, in the meantime, Rena moved to Southern California and became the president, executive director of the California Conference on Equality and Justice. We had already had a relationship early on with Rena. I don't know if any of you were here after the Charlottesville massacre. We had a discussion right here in this room around a circle, and Rena came in and facilitated that and did just an amazing job. And we'd started to do some work with her, kind of exploring, well, what is the work that we have to do with the staff? And then she took the job at CCEJ, and she said, this is what we do. And we started out by saying every year we have a vestry staff conference. So let's take this next vestry staff conference, which was last spring. It was totally on Zoom. Let's bring in the folks from CCEJ and do just sort of a morning, sort of a short session, 3 or 4 hours, that really kind of gets us introduced to basic concepts of white supremacy culture, so we can get a sense of what this journey might be like. And so we did that with vestry and program staff. And we had people saying it was like, for a Zoom conference, they said it was like one of the best vestry staff conferences they'd ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. It was insightful because part of doing this work is when you talk about racism and white supremacy and bias and microaggressions, all those sorts of topics, it's the water we swim in, right? That we all are impacted by it. And someone explained to me, it's almost like, back in the day, if you would go to Las Vegas, they still allow smoking in buildings. And so even if you're not a smoker, if you've been there and you've been around it, right, when you get home, you unpack your clothing, it smells like smoke, even if you weren't a part of it, because it's the air that's around you. And that's a lot of the analogy that I find about racism is that even if you're not someone actively being racist, right, we're all impacted by it. And as a matter of that, we need to find tools and resources on how to talk about race and racism, how to talk about identity, strategies for dismantling. And so it was important if we decided as a vestry that this was the work of our generation, that we brought in a resource to really help us, an outside resource, to help us have those conversations. And it was really incredible. And one of the things that we did was we had affinity spaces, so that were based on race. We had a space for white identified folks and people of color, and really sort of talked about our experiences here at All Saints, as you know, what you've experienced, what you've witnessed, and we came back together as a group and centered the voices of the people of color. And the things that came out, we as people of color were surprised at some of the things that we had heard. People who are attorneys, who have had parishioners, you know, in leadership come up to them and say, oh, I thought you were a gardener. You know, those sorts of microaggressions that have happened that you wouldn't think would happen here at All Saints, because that's not, quote unquote, who we are. And so in doing this work and this journey, just from the beginning of the vestry conference, we realized there's a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of conversations that we need to have, and this was just the start of it. And so CCEJ has been such an incredible partner and resource in helping us really dive into that and give it, you know, sort of having an outside lens and outside resource to guide those really challenging conversations.
Yeah, and I'll say one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, and so hopefully you're breathing at this point. You're great, is one of the things that really sold me, and this is all I'd ever known Rena to be, that sold me on the work of CCEJ and what was how we needed to work together as partners in this is the approach that you all take, which I think is the only way to do this, is, first of all, we're going to look everything full in the face. We're not going to say, you know, we're not going to be afraid of looking at any of the realities. And we're going to do it in love. You know, this is not going to, you know, we're going to hear all the hard things. Many of them are going to be creating space for us to hear them from each other. And it's natural to sometimes, you know, especially if you look like me, go to the guilt place, go to the shame place. We're going to love each other through that, because that's not the purpose of this. We're going to love each other through this. And you all as CCEJ, you approach this from a growth mentality of, that's what we're all here to do. We're all here to grow. We're all here to create beloved community. And so that's something I've really appreciated about that. And as I have continued on my own learning curve with this, I have felt embraced and loved through this process, and I'm grateful for that. So with that, Daniel, I want to turn it over to you. And can you sort of share the current work that we're doing, and as a vestry and program staff and members of that, just sort of, and sort of what the aims are and kind of the nitty-gritty of it too.
Yes, absolutely happy to. Thank you, everyone. Oh, it's nice to see familiar faces. Through the mask, I'm recognizing folks. Ran into Jenny in the elevator, so that was nice. Still morning, I think. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Solis. I'm with the California Conference for Equality and Justice, and part of my challenge this morning, besides traffic from Long Beach, is also, this is one of my first public being in-person events since the pandemic, since we've been only now starting to transition to being in person. So speaking with a mask is a lot harder than I remembered. So if I get a little lightheaded, please know that it's because I'm still learning how to breathe through this and talk at the same time. But I did have a little bit of a slideshow. I don't know. Oh, okay. Well then, we'll just do it this way. That's okay. So, thank you for that beautiful, and like everything you said was more than I can say, so I won't rehash things. But just to share a little bit about our organization. So we've been here in Southern California since 1963, and so we were part of a former national organization called the National Conference for Community and Justice, formerly known as the National Conference for Christians and Jews. Sometimes folks know us under those names. But we've been doing this work since then, right, focusing on issues of identity, inclusion, right, bringing people together to end these systems of inequities, right? And so we work really with focus on race, but we also talk about issues of gender identity, sexuality, interfaith dialogue, right? So trying to bring people together across multiple lines of difference. Oh, there's the breath. Okay. And so part of our work, right, is really, as Mike was saying, that we are really about bringing people together, right, and across the lines of differences, through dialogue, through facing hard and uncomfortable conversations. And so the work we're providing for the All Saints Church community is kind of in two phases, right? So this first phase that we're currently in is training. So we're providing training for members, and here, help me if I forget some of the groups, but for obviously leadership, right, for staff, for members of the vestry, and then also the Racial Justice Advisory Board. Okay. think I got it all. So those groups are moving through 6 sessions of trainings. Each training is 3 hours, and we're doing that through 2 kind of home-based cohorts, as well as doing some affinity group. So our next session, actually in December, we'll be meeting in racial affinity groups. And each session is focused on a specific skill or knowledge base that's important to building an overall stronger way to both participate in dialogues about racial justice, but also to develop and sharpen your lens. So our first session, we were talking about excuse me, race stories, right? Kind of these early experiences or concepts, right? Sometimes we call those stereotypes that really inform how we think and feel and even perceive some of these issues, right? Sometimes we get the stories that race has been solved, right? Martin Luther King got most of that done, and then Barack Obama came and finished it off. But I think as we most know, that's not quite true, right? The reality is way more complex than that. And so we do some kind of checking in on like what are some of those common sense, maybe sometimes hidden, right, stories or assumptions or beliefs that kind of guide how we navigate things. And so that's our first session. Our second session, which we just had yesterday, was very powerful. And we were talking about conflict and feelings and how do we navigate that and how does that sometimes maybe lead us to avoid having these hard and honest conversations, right? If we're worried about, can we disagree? Can we be in conflict? Will that break our relationship? Or maybe I never learned how to do that. I never learned to turn to Monique and say, I disagree with you, which I don't. But but if I did, how do we do that, right? In a way that builds our relationship together, that doesn't break us apart. And then adding the layer of racial identity to that, right, with all of its history. So we spent a lot of time yesterday, there's my breath, talking about that. And so our next session will be looking at identity. So who are we? How do we think of ourselves? What are the parts of us that feel important? And how is that connected, right, to issues of white supremacy and racism? Okay, make it easy. I'm still trying to figure out like my usual pre-mask, like excited and trying to get everyone, hyped up on a Sunday morning. But then I have to breathe through the mask. Okay. So then after that, we're going to be having other sessions, like one explicitly talking about anti-blackness, right? What does that mean for everyone, whether we're white, whether we're black, whether like me or non-black person of color? What is our position? What is our responsibility around those issues? We're also going to be talking about accountability. So what happens when we make mistakes? What happens when we harm people? What happens when we act from a place of bias? How do we make amends? How do we take responsibility? How do we rebuild trust with each other? And there's another session that I'm forgetting. Oh, about values. Yes, which is really important, right? Because having our values, what do we believe about justice and fairness and responsibility, right? And that might seem a little kind of a detour, but we find that like when there's all these pressures and when we're maybe embarrassed or we're afraid to act, what is it that we tap into, right? And our values, as I'm sure you all know, right, is what kind of can help us get through that, right? What do we believe about the world? What's the legacy we want to leave behind? So we have another session coming up on that. And so we're going to do this until, I believe, March, is when we'll finish up the training series. And then from there we have what we're calling kind of a planning and culture building phase where we're going to work to take another kind of look at the the racial justice advisory recommendations, right, that have been so important to the work you've all been doing around racial justice, and having a real broad process to look at them, update them, see if there's gaps, see if there's ways to deepen them, right, if there's ways to spread some of this work into the rest of the congregation. And so our role is kind of be facilitating that. We'll be working with people to make some lots of decisions, right, hopefully getting lots of input from everybody in the congregation. So so that's kind of our 2 parts, and I guess maybe to back up a little bit, the training in our thinking is about building both skills, about knowledge, about comfort, that can then kind of be diffused, right, the members of the training series. So I'll just maybe pause there, yeah.
Yeah, it's just part of what I love about this approach is when I hear training, a lot of times what I think is, okay, like you're going to open up my head and pour a whole bunch of new knowledge in, and I'm going to learn all these things, and certainly I'm learning things. The training, and it really gets into what we did yesterday. We had a whole session on conflict styles. The training is really helping us learn how to listen to each other, to recognize every one of us comes from a specific vantage point that has to do not only with our social location, but our own personal history, our family of origin, you name it. It's all stirring up in there every time we have a personal interaction with people. And there's also power dynamics going on, some of which we may be aware of very much, some of which we may not be. And so the question is, the way we grow is by being in relationship with each other. So how do we learn to have conversations, to listen deeply, to be able to disagree with each other? This is a skill that is going to continue to transform this entire congregation. Because you look around our world, and you certainly look around our country today, we don't know how to do this. We've never been given the skills of how do we have real conversations and do deep listening with people who disagree with us. Sometimes we can't even have really good conversations with people who agree with us. And so, if you look, I always think about George Regis's words, whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on your journey of faith, you are welcome to come to Christ's table. Well, if we're serious about that, and I absolutely believe we are, it means we're going to get a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different opinions coming to the table. It's the Sunday before Thanksgiving. We know what that is like. And we want All Saints Church to be better than the nightmare Thanksgiving dinner that most of us probably have had, where we're just trying to, not throw the mashed potatoes at Uncle Fred. To really be there with each other. And I see that beginning to happen. And when I think about, where can we go as a congregation? Yeah, there'll be sort of articles of read this or do this. Stuff I get excited about is how much we can really learn to listen to each other and hear each other. Because what's converting of heart is relationship. That's what we mean when we say God dwells in you. I'm going to stop preaching in a second. Is we believe that God dwells in every single person, and the God in you has a chance to convert me more deeply to live into the God that's in me. So, you want to jump on with that?
Yeah, I think, and so one of the things, just in line with training, is particularly when you do trainings around racial justice or something that's difficult and hard, right, is that there's a sense of discomfort, and there is a natural sense of discomfort, and not just amongst, I think a lot of times we think of white identified people as being uncomfortable, but a lot of folks of different races are uncomfortable. And what was really revealed during these trainings, the first one we talked about are race stories, and how was race discussed, if at all, in your family and your family history. And depending on where you were, who you were, that was at different levels. And then the other piece that we had, thank you, Claire, was conversations about conflict. And it was interesting of the intersections of, particularly I identify as someone who's Southern. I was on a call with someone else who's Southern who happens to be white. And the interactions and intersections between how conflict and race was handled in our families that was very similar because we're Southern. So one of the things that I really love about the space is that it has created a space for us to connect, both intra-racially. I've connected with so many incredible people of color in those spaces, but also interracially, people who don't look like me, who I might look at and think, oh, we don't have anything in common. But we're in this space, and it's a brave space, which I love. It's a courageous space because we're not, sinking back. We are called to be brave and to be courageous and to be on this journey of conversation in community together. And that's one of the things that's been the most beautiful thing for me, and we're only 2 sessions in. And I mean, let me just tell y'all, getting up at 9 o'clock in the morning or being camera ready at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday after working a full work week, I was like, I don't know. And every session I've left feeling rejuvenated and just feeling more connected to folks.
Yeah, and this is the piece that we're most excited about. And part of it also is we can't just say, great, let's jump in right now and do all this with the congregation. Because, first of all, systems never leapfrog their leadership in health and awareness. And so the vestry is your elected leadership. You elected the vestry, and you elected a really great vestry, and the staff. And so we need to, this is the work we're doing right now, is we're starting to equip ourselves, and it'll be a long journey. And as we do, say, okay, what does it mean for everyone else? But, as much I tend to get excited and say, great, let's do this for everybody. And the truth is, there's patience that's necessary for this work. And it is going to pay off in so many different areas, both because race touches absolutely everything in our lives, and because the skill of having hard conversations will apply literally everywhere. And so at this point, we got about 20 minutes. I really want to open it up to conversations. Actually, sort of Steve and Clara and Julianne, particularly if you had anything to add. But Steve, go ahead. I'm going to jump this to you.
Thank you so much. This is great, and it's a great conversation, and obviously, it's not about the race, it's about the journey. It's a much longer run, but I want to just bring out a couple of points about the Racial Justice Advisory Board. It is an advisory board to the vestry. So different than other ministries and ministry groups in the church, it's meant there to really give direction to the vestry. And that secondly, what is unique about it is that it's the only committee that actually has non-members of All Saints Church that are on the committee, which is important because I think the discussion we've always had is like, how is All Saints perceived in the community? So having those external voices makes a really big thing. It kind of checks us. So I just wanted to make a point about that. And then secondly is that the CCEJ training for the leaders is not meant to be singular, but ultimately it's going to also go to the congregation, right? That this is sort of the first phase of it, but it's meant to be something, and the vestry has talked about this, right? That it will be rolled out to the church at large. So, yeah.
Clara or Julianne, I want to give you first chance. Anything more that you want to add?
Good morning. I am a part of the Racial Justice Advisory Board, and I also am co-facilitator with Carol Lundberg for the Racial Justice Ministry. And the resolutions that came out of the Racial Justice Ministry and evolved to the Racial Justice Advisory Board are very thorough. I mean, it's other churches have copied this model for the Racial Justice Advisory Boards putting together the resolutions. So this is a work that the RJAB had worked on for at least 2 or 3 years, and we're just excited and delighted that it's in the first phase and it's going forward with the leadership. So I will yield the mic back.
Okay, yeah, and this is, I would say, questions, and also here, I'm going to come to you, Janet. If there's just things you think we need to hear, and it's also okay to say, wow, this makes me really nervous, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, absolutely. So just whatever you think you want to say or share or hear.
Thank you, and I understand, I think, the reason for this being a slow and moderate process, but I'm impatient, and I'm a kind of wishy-washy, elderly, white liberal, and I'd like to go away with something in my hand that says, or in my mind, that says next week or next month I will really watch out for, see what I'm doing with, think more about.
I'll kick that over to Monique and Daniel.
Well, I really appreciate that wishy-washy elderly white liberals are one of my favorites, so really appreciate that. But I think you speak to a point that something in our work that we have found that there's the immensity of this work, the immensity of trying to stop white supremacy to some kind of atonement, for all of the deep violence and history that's interwoven into this country and the legacy that all of us are inherited, whether whatever identity is, we all are having to grapple with this as Americans, as people living in this country at this time. There's, I think, a pressure, to rush, to do something, to act, and that is critical, We must act. There's so much happening in the world and within our communities, within ourselves. But I think that pressure to measure this work, to measure its impact through how much we're doing, is something that I think we all have to be in a critical dialogue and reflection about, because I think that's one of the core values, of white supremacy, is do more, just do it, just kind of perform, We see that kind of pressure in our institutions, Release a statement, something happened, and I think this work, the real transformation, takes a long time, And I think I think it was Steve actually said, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I think having to think about how do we, sorry, this thing is, the day when the pandemic is out of its current phase. But I think having the space to reflect and really think about where is it that we most can act, where can we have the most impact, and also to be honest about where is it that we need the most support in, I think that's a helpful way to maybe think about like, what is this community going through, how is this going to take time, and then what are places that maybe the congregation who's not going through the training at the current moment that they could act, right? There are spaces to gather in affinity groups, right, to dialogue, to do some reflection work. There's also, I'm really glad that we're talking about the way the church is seen in the community. There are ways to also maybe act and kind of show up in protests and marches and different activities. But I do think one of the things we're trying to help do some reflection with the leadership of the church is maybe breaking out of that cycle of reaction and just quickly doing something to do something, as opposed to what is the thing that the church is most called to do, both in itself and in the world, right? So hopefully that was, actually maybe it was a non-answer, but.
And I think to remember that this work is uncomfortable. It just is. And part of some of the language in the resolution is learning how to sit in the discomfort. Because particularly as a Western society, we want to run to how do we solve the problem. And even when we wrote the resolution, it was like, okay, check, resolution's done. We're going to put that on a shelf. And we were like, no. We need to unpack this. We need to figure out how to apply this. This isn't just something that's representative on a wall. This is going to take work. And so a lot of times we rush to get out of that discomfort by solving the problem because we don't want to be uncomfortable. We need to sit in the discomfort. We need to go through the process together and come with those solutions. And there's steps along the way. There's education pieces, there's resources, there's things that are going to be done. But in terms of, ding dong, racism's dead, that's not going to happen. We need to sit in this space and we need to do some processing and some of the harder work.
Robert, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say too that, this time is also a time for us to continue to uncover the truth of who we are. So personally, interpersonally, and at a systemic level, we're doing work to uncover the stories about some of the things related to the property and related to some of the physical aspects of the church. That's part of it, and part of it is an opportunity that we all have to just continue to explore what's really going on here. Who am I in community with here at All Saints? And what are my assumptions about how they're experiencing this church? I think we often think, the way I'm experiencing All Saints must be the way everyone else is experiencing All Saints, and I think Monica shared just a few examples of how that's not true. A question I ask myself and I ask other people that I come in contact with is, why are you choosing to be here? And it's really interesting the difference in answers you get from people based on their race. There's, sometimes someone saying, there are certain things that are said in the pulpit that are very important for me to hear in my church. And there are, for many of us, it was the presence of Zelda Kennedy at one point, and the importance of having her tremendous leadership here to connect to. And we have lost Zelda, and that's a grieving process that's still going on for many of us. And recognizing that, we're not all having the same experience here, but there's something we're here for. So that's the point. That's where we kind of attach, say we have a reason to be here, but what else is going on, and how can we prepare ourselves to do better? So just any learning that you can do about the experience that other people are having. There are tools out there. Something that the Racial Justice Advisory Board went through was we went through the Harvard Implicit Bias Assessment. It helps you to just understand a little bit about sort of the unconscious level of what's going on with yourself as an individual. Is just one kind of building block. So just it's not only that we're waiting to be trained, it's there are ways to learn while we're waiting, for our turn to be trained.
Yeah, and I will just riff off that, and so you're getting a big answer to your question, and then we'll go over here. So the Racial Justice Ministry is continually having really amazing programming that is for just this purpose, for all of us to learn and engage with each other. So keep your eyes open for that. Dr. Will Gaffney is coming back here in the middle of January. We're going to hopefully do a day-long thing, or most of the day on Saturday, and then she's going to be here in the forum and preaching on Sunday. Come to that. We're going to be continuing to provide opportunities for us to engage this. The other thing is, look for opportunities for conversation. If you were at church at 9 o'clock, or you're going to be at 11:30, I preached a sermon that dealt with a lot of these issues. If there's something in that bothers you, or call me up, email me, let's get together, have a cup of coffee, let's talk about it. That's the kind of thing that we can continue to do, is have those conversations with each other while we're skill building to do the other things. So I think over here, you had your hand up. Did you have your hand up earlier? Yes.
I don't know where to start. I have so much to say. Some of you probably saw on MSNBC, and it was on another network, I don't remember the name, it's called Civil War. I don't know if people here saw it. I thought it was so thought-provoking, and something that would be very helpful in training processes. I don't know how one would get it, but it's 2 hours and 15 minutes, and it gives perspectives on race, the South from the Civil War, but updated and what teachers are trying to do in the classroom. I got something in the mail. I live in San Marino. I never wanted to live in San Marino when I moved there in the 1960s because everybody was white like me. I wanted the diversity of Pasadena. My husband thought of property values and school reputations, and so we moved to San Marino. I'm delighted now that I'm in the minority. My life has been so enriched by my community. I'm now a minority even on my block. There's 9 native white individuals on my street. There's more Koreans, more Chinese. We have Malaysians, Thailand, Saudi Arabia. So I love it. I love the diversity. And I've received in the mail this past week something from the city of San Marino that they're forming. I think you'll all be happy to know, a racial justice committee and equity committee, and so I'm hoping to learn from all of you. So if I'm accepted on this committee, to help them at defining what they're going to do to deal with this. Also, I taught U.S. history at Poly and Westridge, and I have a deep commitment, particularly to African Americans. I've never had a friend that's African American in my life, and I feel cheated. And I don't know if I ever will, but it's my dream that I can have that happen in my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John?
Well, as a member of All Saints and Radical Inclusion, and in listening to others, I find that there's a premise or place to come from that I learned a while ago, that you are all, anyone you're talking to, you're whole, complete, and perfect, exactly the way you are, and exactly the way you're not. And that allows me, if I can hold that, to hear people from where they are, whole, complete, and perfect, exactly the way you are and exactly the way you're not. Doesn't mean you're not going to evolve, not going to change. But for me, I experienced racism as something that was taught. I knew it was being taught before I was taught it. So I had a safeguard, but that doesn't mean I didn't get incorporated with all the structural racisms and participation and privilege. But I think if we hold on to how do we open ourselves to what we don't know so we can hear. And I'd like comments on that. Or
Thank you. Any comments on what John said?
I think that's a really excellent question, and I think that's at the heart of the work that I think CCEJ is trying to support, that I think is already really strong in this church. Is like, what's that interplay? What is our responsibility? What is our power, right, to shift some of those structures, right, and to maybe chip away at this like centuries-old system, right, of white supremacy. What's our legacy that we can leave? And I think part of that is, like, as you said, is being open to learning. But I think it's also important to being open to learning that maybe we're acting or harming people in a way that we weren't aware of. You know, I think that's something that is really, really important in this work. You know, just to share a little bit more about myself, CCJ, we have a camp that we have for high school students, right? And where we talk about these issues, the students get to share their stories. And I was thankfully able to go when I was in high school. So I've actually been part of CCJ for most of my life. And I value so much in the sense of like learning, connection. And And I say that to say that, like, I've been thinking about these issues for most of the time that I've been alive. And not to say that there's like a level of, or threshold where we reach that we're masters or competent of this thing. But I constantly operate from stereotypes. I constantly operate from bias. I constantly am harming people. I'm constantly perpetuating unequal power dynamics, right? And that humility that I need to stay connected to is one of the hardest things for me, and I think for a lot of people in this work. Like, I can understand, oh yeah, white supremacy, right, was created through enslavement, taking away and committing murder or genocide of indigenous people, right? It's brought people in of other races into different subordinate positions, right? And I get to know about anti-black stereotypes. I can know about stereotypes against Asian American communities, and I catch myself acting from them, right? I catch myself, oh, what did I just do? Did I just belittle someone? Did I minimize someone? Did I dismiss someone? Did I avoid someone? Did I assume that we wouldn't connect? Did I cut somebody off? And so I think that part of, like, constantly self-reflecting, constantly be ready to take responsibility for how we're acting and how we are operating from the smoke, right? The casino smoke, right? That's way more toxic. I think is really important, and I think that as long as we stay rooted there, and that, like, as much as we learn, as much as we grow, as much as we connect, that we can always harm each other. Like, we can always perpetuate these dynamics, right? I think is one of the really important things that I think is important for all of us to kind of stay connected to.
Just real quick on that, I think just also recognizing that racism and white supremacy operates at many different levels. So there's like the personal level, the interpersonal level, structural level, cultural level, and a lot of the work that we're going to be doing and that we are starting as leadership is really looking at those pieces, those structural pieces, and what that actually means and what it means to break those down and interrogate them and figure out what they're about. What are the images that are around our church, and what is that? Is that inviting people in, or is that dispelling people? It's not just about sort of, it is about our one-on-one interaction and proximity and being proximate to people who are different than you, but it's about all those other pieces of structures that sort of inform how we see, others. When we say something like a pastor, what's the first image that comes to our mind, right? Is it a white man over 60? Is it a black woman? Is it, right? So that's a part of structural racism, even how we think about leadership and who should be in leadership and sort of all of that. So I think it's just to Daniel's point, it's about really being aware of that smoke and constantly sort of interrogating and understanding that it's operating on different levels, the structural, the interpersonal, the cultural.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more. I want to make sure if there's a person of color that would like to say anything or talk. Yeah, Julianne.
Thanks. I think kind of tacking onto that, one of the reasons why this work is so important to me and where I root myself in this work, there is a woman in Australia. She's Aboriginal, she's an activist, she's an artist, and what she says is that if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you're here because your liberation is tied up in my liberation, then let's work together. And so that's the place of me saying, I understand that my liberation is tied up in Monique's liberation, and it's tied up in Barbara's liberation, and it's tied up in Clara's liberation. And until we all have the opportunity to exist in equality, not just interpersonally, but in the structures and in the opportunities we have, and that touches everything about our lives. Until I understand that none of us can be free, until all of us are free, and what that actually means, and how we interpret that, and how we actively pursue that, then the work doesn't mean anything, because it's not about us being nice people. And so we have to get over that idea of being like the nice ones.
Amen. I think that's a great way to wrap this up. This is going to be a continuing conversation, and can you stick around for a little bit, Dan? And I think Barbara, and I think if you want to continue the conversation here with members of the Racial Justice Advisory Board, the wardens, Daniel, please stick around. Can we just give thanks to everyone for the work that everyone's doing, and to you all. Next Sunday's forum is going to be great. We're really looking at the intersection of the pandemic and the arts. We're going to have a great panel of people: Vijay Gupta, Rena Esmail, Jenny Wong, Andre Henry, Amy Brenneman, Mike Hernandez, a whole group of artists talking about how did art sustain them, how did art affect them as artists during the pandemic, and what is the role of art in both interpreting what has happened in this event in our lives and also helping us emerge in a healing way from the pandemic. So be sure and come by, whether it's online or here afterwards. I've got to close this off because Keith's got to get back to the church, but so bye everybody, thanks a lot. You can continue the conversation here.